So in our last presentation, we learned about active and passive transport. Today we're going to dive further into our understanding of osmosis, which, if you remember, is passive transport, specifically the movement of water from high concentrations to low concentrations. So we're going to talk more about osmosis today. First, I want to introduce you to some vocabulary words: hypertonic, isotonic, and hypotonic. So hypertonic, this prefix hyper, is really important. So when we have a hypertonic solution, what happens is that to reach equilibrium, water leaves the cell. And when water leaves that cell, it causes the cell to shrink, making it shriveled, like you see in these pictures here. That is called a hypertonic solution. Hypotonic is the exact opposite. This is when water moves from outside of the cell inside the cell, and it causes the cell to swell, and if it swells too much, that cell can even explode. And I like to remember that hypo kind of looks like hippo, and hippos are really cute. I'm going to draw a hippo right here. You're going to think he's so cute. Oh man, he only has 3 legs. Here's our cute little hippo. It's like a mouth. There you go. Hippos are cute and fat, and they're so big, and that is what happens to a hypertonic solution, is it swells and swells and swells until it explodes like a big fat hippo, as you can see pictured here. That looks like nothing like a hippo. Please do not judge my skills. Now here in the middle we have isotonic. This is when water moves equally across the cell membrane because the cell is already at equilibrium. This is called an isotonic solution. So on the previous slide, we saw what happens when animal cells are in hypertonic, isotonic, or hypotonic conditions. But let's talk a little bit about the difference between what happens with plant cells and animal cells. Plant cells are a little bit different because if you remember, they have this thing called a cell wall. And so this cell wall provides some protection from them, and they aren't as likely to explode like an animal cell will. In a hypertonic solution, when that water is moving out, you will see that this cell wall stays in place. And instead, inside of that cell wall, the cell membrane shrinks. And so the cell itself shrinks within the cell wall. In a hypotonic solution, the cell swells and it pushes that cell wall out a little bit, but it does not explode in the same way that an animal cell would because of that structure of the cell wall. And lastly, in an isotonic solution or condition, we see water moving equally between inside and outside of the cell. So we're going to go ahead and look at some examples and make some predictions about how water moves when a cell is placed inside of a beaker. So that circle right there is the cell, and the beaker is around it. Both are filled with solutions. So here outside in the beaker, we have 85% water and 15% solute. Inside of the cell, we have 90% water and 10% solute. We know that water moves from high concentration to low concentrations. The high concentration in this circumstance is inside of the cell because 90 is greater than 85. We know that means that water will then move out of the cell. Now, while water moves with a net force out of the cell, there is still a little bit of water that moves inside of the cell. So most water is moving out, but still a little bit of water is moving in. And if water is moving out, we know that it is going to cause what sort of solution? Hopefully you know, hypertonic. So this is a hypertonic situation. Let's look at this next example. Inside of the cell is 40% water, and outside of the cell is 90% water. 90 is greater than 40, so 90% that water will move inside of the cell at a greater rate than it moves out. Since water is moving inside of the cell, this is hypotonic. Remember, like a hippo. All right, let's look at another example together. Here inside of the cell is 75% water, outside of the cell is 80% water. That means to move from high to low through the process of osmosis, most of the water will be moving in, but still some water moves out. Since most of the water is moving in, we know this is once again hypotonic. All right, I would like you to pause the video and try these 3 examples to see if you can get them correct. Please go ahead and pause the video. So hopefully you paused the video and took the time to practice whether you knew these questions. In the first one, there's a higher concentration of water outside of the cell, so water is moving into the cell, and that is hypotonic. In the second example, water is moving out of the cell because there's a higher concentration of water inside of the cell, and that is hypertonic. In the last one, we have 50% water on each side, which means that water is going to move in and out of the cell equally. This is an isotonic situation. So hopefully understanding the difference between hypotonic, hypertonic, and isotonic now makes sense to you. Hopefully you feel confident with your ability to predict where water will move either into or out of a cell in order to reach equilibrium. You do not need to finish the rest of these notes as we will finish them together in class.